can start. Yeah. Okay, it's a pleasure to introduce Prashan Ranasinghe. He's a professor, associate professor in the Department of Criminology, University of Ottawa, and visiting scholar in the History of Consciousness department between January and May 2024. So if you want to talk to Pranash, you have just a few weeks.
3 weeks, yeah.
3 weeks. His first book was titled Helter Shelter, Security, Legality, and the Ethic of Care, University of Toronto Press, 2017. Now he's working in his work is more theoretical and more philosophical. He switched his interest into philosophy. And the new book, the forthcoming book, is titled The Homelessness of Being, Heidegger and the Meaning of Existence. That is, I assume, something that you will talk about today in your talk.
Briefly,
because, yeah. And the title of the talk of today is Heidegger, Christian Eschatology and the Temporality of Being. You have the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you again for being available and for being here and to discuss your work with all of us.
Yeah, lovely. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming in. I should say, thank you for the invite to talk. I've been here, as said, since about mid-January, and we leave on May 30th, and so far it's been a blast, not just personally and intellectually, but I have 2 young boys, and they're just having a wonderful time. So, so thank you for that. Thank you, Max. And I really should... I should thank Robert, who was, I think, kind enough. Maybe he felt sorry for me when I emailed him and said, I'd like to visit. So, he sort of got the ball going. So I'm forever grateful. And I thank you for that. So as mentioned, I have a forthcoming book, which should be out in December, if everything goes according to plan. Well, they have a date, so it really should. But it's called The Homelessness of Being, Heidegger and the Meaning of Existence. Now, this talk is actually it's just loosely sort of based on that, because I kind of moved off on that. And I would just want to explain what I mean by that. While I was writing that book, I reread Heidegger to sort of make the claim that what it means to be human is to be homeless. And I sort of theorized that through the concept of nothingness as this sort of unfinished state of what it means to be. And while I was writing and revising, one of the things that struck me was that there are very clear parallels between what Heidegger is doing or trying to do and what one can see in Christianity, in particular in terms of a Christian eschatology. And so, since I've been here, and probably for the last 8 months, I've been sort of working on this project, which I'm hoping will turn out into another book. And so what I want to talk to you about is, in some ways, the groundwork that I'm laying for this project, the current one that I'm writing right now. And so it's not obviously completed, but there is enough, I think, there to present with the purpose, of course, of trying to get aid in framing and guiding in terms of what is essentially yet a project to bring to fruition. So with that, I suppose I should get started. So taking then Heidegger's philosophical endeavor to foreground being, an endeavor sustained by his belief that between the time of Plato and Nietzsche, Western philosophy has all but forgotten about and thus neglected this concept of being. What I want to do today is that I want to make a case for an inextricable link between Heidegger's philosophy and Christian theology, and argue that it is impossible to understand Heidegger's philosophy without its Christian, but especially eschatological roots and grounding. That Heidegger is and was, I suppose, heavily influenced by Christian theology is not necessarily novel. This argument in some ways has been made, and it's being slowly made now. The work of someone like Judith Wolff, for example, would come to mind in terms of laying what she calls an eschatology without an eschaton in Heidegger's early work. And at the same time, it's not really surprising at all that his philosophy is heavily grounded in Christianity and Christian eschatology. And the reason for that, partly at least, is that Heidegger was studying to be a Catholic priest. He renounces his Catholicism, he moves into Protestantism, and sort of embraces that, and then completely renounces that as well, and leaves all of theology for what he would essentially want to find is a more pure way of understanding who we are, this concept of being. So as such, I want to say that Heidegger's exploration of being is his attempt to resuscitate a philosophy which he saw as heavily impoverished, both because of its neglect of being, but perhaps more importantly, because since Nietzsche's pronouncement of a dead God and with it the substitution of an eternal recurrence, which he believes brought about a profound sort of, in particular, European nihilism, as Heidegger's student Karl Löwit would put it. He believed that that philosophy was essentially unable to respond to this sort of nihilism that had overtaken Europe. So Heidegger situates himself within that sort of moment in trying to understand how we can move forward in terms of who we are and what we're doing. So for the particular purposes that I want to do in terms of today is I want to use Heidegger as a lens to probe Western philosophy. Because his work can, in some ways at least, be thought of as an intellectual history of the prehistory of that philosophy. And I say prehistory because of its apparent failure to take on the concept of being. And doing that, I want to make the claim that Heidegger's reliance on Christian eschatology reflects a broader sort of parallel in Western philosophy that is heavily influenced by Christianity, either by subscribing to it or in terms of a negation. But that flavor, that grounding, is heavily there. So one can think of Nietzsche as perhaps the best example, or one can even think of someone like Derrida as an example of the influence of Christianity in there. And we can, I suppose, talk about that more as we go. And of course, this argument that, philosophy is grounded in some ways by theology, and in particular Christian theology, is not really, I mean, it might sound controversial, but I don't think it has the sort of controversy in terms of what I'm making. Somebody can think of Karl Löwit's The Meaning of History, which essentially lays down the fact that, obviously from the time of Augustine, but all the way to Hegel and Marx and so on, there is an eschatology that grounds their sort of thinking. So the one thing I should say is in trying to do something like this, there will be at times some sort of flattening in the argument, because I'm taking Heidegger, so 50 years or so. I will omit many of the thinkers that he's in some ways influenced by, Kierkegaard, Luther, so on. I'll talk about them briefly as it comes up. So there is that sort of flattening. But I should also say that my argument here is not that Heidegger is solely influenced by Christianity. That is not my argument. It's just one aspect of it. Okay, so there is no doubt that he's influenced by Greek thinkers and the pre-Socratics. There is no doubt that he's influenced by the poet Hölderlin, as an example. I'm going to be sort of bypassing that and focusing largely on one aspect of it, in some ways neglected, but in some ways no, of his relation between his philosophy of being and Christianity, in particular Christian eschatology. So that's what I'd like to do in the time that I have. And I suppose I'm going to start by locating Heidegger in relation to time and temporality, which is what he's quite well known for. So in a book called, and it's not really even a book, it's an essay, probably about 25 pages, called The Concept of Time, which was published in 1924, so 3 years before the big one, Being in Time. Heidegger says that to even begin to think philosophically about time necessitates acknowledging its debt to theology, and essentially the monopoly that theology has over the notion of time. And I think the best example here, one can think of Augustine, and one can think of his Confessions and how his notion of trying to make sense of time and who we are in relation to God influences as Western philosophy in some ways, at least. So it is this monopoly that theology has held, or supposedly held, not just upon the conceptualization of time, but upon other important questions about existence that Heidegger seeks to distance himself from and carve out a philosophy proper that does not adhere to faith and other forms of supposed rigid and antiquated thinking. Okay, so prior to about 1920, Heidegger is heavily influenced by theology. He himself claims that he's a theologian with the emphasis on the logos aspect of it. Okay, post 1921 and so on, well into being in time, he completely has renounced theology as completely problematic in terms of understanding who we are. And as this argument goes, towards the end of his career, it looks like he comes right back to this theology, the very one that he sort of renounces. Okay? So before turning then to how temporality can be viewed in Christianity, itself a sort of loaded term that we can talk about later, I want to look briefly at Heidegger's rendering of time and temporality. Okay, so in the most straightforward sense, and I suppose in the most simplistic sense, Heidegger's conceptualization of being is inextricably linked to time and temporality. Okay, the most famous example, perhaps, is his use of the hammer as one example of equipment in terms of what we have present to us and ready as well to us. And so Heidegger essentially goes, what one uses a hammer for is with a very specific purpose in mind. So let's just say to build a house. Okay. And so one builds a house because one wants to protect oneself, one wants to be comfortable, so on and so forth. Okay. So as such, in the very usage of the hammer, the now is already in the there here being a future. Okay. And the there is a future that is already is, even though it is not yet. Okay, because I'm building a hammer with the purposes of a future of a house that is not yet, but is already in here now because that's what I'm doing. Okay, so very crudely put then, one is already ahead of oneself. Okay, the argument that one can sort of live in the moment in terms of at least what Heidegger is saying is not possible. You can never really have, at least as I read Heidegger, a pure now. Okay, you can never understand time as a series of nows. One understands one understands time, in particular temporality, simultaneously, not sequentially, right? So not in terms of linear time. In this simultaneity, the future is prioritized over the other two. So in particular, in the present and the past. Okay, the point I want to make then is that Heidegger's rendition of being is temporal, and to claim that it is temporal is to claim that the three ecstasies of time, as he calls them, past, present, future, are enfolded. Okay, they come together. And in coming together, the future, the not yet, is at the same time made present and given priority. Okay, this way of thinking, I want to say, in some ways, he's borrowing directly from somebody like Augustine. Okay, so I'm just picking two places in his work. I understand that, but in book 11 of book 11 of Augustine's Confessions spends a great deal of time trying to theorize what time is and how we make sense of it. There, for example, Augustine writes not something to the effect, but he writes this quote: "Out of the future, the present is made," which echoes much of what Heidegger is talking about. At other times, he talks about, quote, "I perceive time to be a certain stretching." Okay, so the coming together of these forms. So what is important then for present purposes is if that Dasein, so Heidegger uses this concept called Dasein, which essentially his usage of a human way of being, a being that tries to understand itself. So if Dasein is mine, okay, everyone has his own Dasein, that mineness is always being there, and the being there is being in and with the future that is yet to be, but which is already present. So the example of the hammer is what he tries to point out, right? This is that sort of unfinished, indeterminate state that one can find in Heidegger's What It Means to Be, which I try to flesh out in the book that should be out this year. Okay, so it is that is in a future that is not yet. What I want to show is that this rendering of temporality that one finds in Heidegger, right, the is that is there, okay? And by the way, Dasein in its sort of literary or transliteration, I suppose, is being there. It's not there that is geographical, it's there in terms of a time. So this is what I mean by the is in the future, which is in the present, okay? So this rendering of temporality, I want to suggest, can actually be found in Judeo-Chrisitanity and in Christian eschatology. And the point that I want to make is that it's not possible to understand Heidegger's exposition of time and temporality in relation to what it means to be without this Christian backdrop, right? It informs the way he comes to understand time. So on that, I'm going to speak now on the notion of the circle. I'm going to take this notion of the circle as a figure to try to unpack what I mean by time in the sort of Judeo-Christian sense, okay? And I'm going to focus on essentially two verses in the book of Job. And the book of Job is one of the oldest pieces of writing that one would find in the Christian Old Testament and in the Hebrew Bible. There is immense debate, as with much of the books in the Bible, in terms of how one dates it. But, you know, there seems to be a rough sort of I don't want to use the word consensus, but at least agreement that it can be located somewhere about 1000 BC. Some people look at it much before, and some people look at it much, not much, but somewhat.
Hello, is this being heard again online? Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, that's all right. It's a good excuse for me to drink some water, yeah. So I want to focus on verse 7, in particular, the last part, which I'm yet to read. And it concerns, as I said, Satan's response to the question, the Lord's question, from where do you come? Okay. Satan's response goes like this. Quote, so Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. End quote. Okay. This very same question and the very same response comes up again in the next chapter, which I can leave. But what I want to note to begin with is this. There is at the very outset a duality between good and evil. Between good and bad, evil and virtue, between God and his enemy or adversary. Okay, and this same duality I will draw attention to when I get to the New Testament and Heidegger's sort of reading of it. This is the fundamental duality or opposition within which Judeo-Christianity and in turn Western civilization plays out and continues to play out. Okay, between good and evil, good and bad, so on and so forth. And when I say something like good and evil, good and bad, one cannot but help think of Nietzsche and his genealogy of morals as driven from good and bad, good and evil, which he inverts, right? He thinks what it was pure has been inverted in Christianity, so he sort of reinverts it again. So, returning then to Satan's response to God's question, it is possible to see what looks to be a particular direction or movement in God's adversary, so Satan, that is a pacing back and forth. Now, this is not to claim that the movement is aimless. That's not the case, but it is a claim that there is a certain pattern of movement that is fraught with futility. Okay, so the to and fro okay, which I want to focus on for a moment, is read from the Hebrew should, that is to go about or rove about. And the walking back and forth is from the word halak, to walk, to go, come, and walk. The key here, okay, at least for me as I read it, is that the go, the come, and the walk is patterned in a certain way, and that this back and forth or to and from, which the word rove or row about gets at, is key. Because if one thinks about what it means to rove or to rove about, at least as you find it in English, then there is a certain sense in some ways of a wandering that is not necessarily with a fixed destination, right? One is sort of just almost so aimlessly going back and forth, okay? As such, the response of God's question appears to paint, as such, the response to God's question, to Satan's response, appears to paint an image of circularity, okay? That is that the pattern of to and fro and back and forth suggests that one is essentially going around in circles, okay? Thus, to God's question, from where do you come? What Satan's response gets at its core, I want to say, is essentially from going around in circles. This is what his response, I want to claim, gets at its heart. Where are you coming from? From going around in circles. Okay, so I should mention, though, that not all biblical commentators would countenance this sort of approach, okay, or at least this sort of circular motive. Some prefer this sort of hurried back and forth movement in a sort of lashing manner, but they emphasize a certain aimlessness to that, okay? I don't want to necessarily emphasize an aimlessness to the movement. When one looks at the sort of the rest of the scripture, it doesn't paint it as something that's aimless. It actually paints it as something very purposing. But I do want to hold on to a circularity, okay? And there are several reasons for holding on to a circularity. I'm just going to go through one, largely because of time, okay? And the major reason that I want to hold on to a circularity is because it captures the distinction between what I said before, and that is a good and evil, with good triumphing in the end, okay? So as such, when one juxtaposes Satan's to and fro's to the to and fro's of God, okay, you see an important difference despite the fact that it is the same language and wording that is used, shoot and halak. Okay, same use, it's just the context is different. And in the context, I think one can read in something that's very different. One9 and one no. Okay, so I'm going to read a brief verse from 2 Chronicles 16:9. Okay, and you'll see what I mean. Quote, "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth," so there's the to and fro, "to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him." End quote. Okay? So here, the eyes of the Lord do run to and fro, but this action is not meant to convey roving, the sort of aimlessness of the wandering. Okay? Because what follows after the to and fro is a very clear description that the action of God's eyes goes to and fro with a very specific purpose. And that very specific purpose is to demonstrate power, might, and sovereignty over those declared as his children. Okay? So in reading the good and bad as an important motive in Christianity and Western civilization, I want to suggest that when God's eyes goes to and fro, what's painted is a very different picture than when his adversary goes to and fro. Okay? So, I have spent time then on this notion of the circle and on the notion of circularity, because I want to make the point that in Christianity, the separation between good and evil, righteous and unrighteous, can be thought of in terms of a figure of the circle, with the unrighteous said to be eternally in a circular motion, going round and round in futility. Okay? And thus, if one merely looks at this circularity in terms of time, okay, this is where I want to get to, and in terms of an anticipation and expectation, to use Heidegger's language, or in terms of hope, to use Christian language, okay, then this time would merely continue with no end or reprieve in sight. It would essentially be, it would amount to a meaninglessness, okay? But as the Christian narrative has it, what happens in and through Christ is that the circle is broken. Okay, and it's broken when he enters into time. And in entering into time, he puts an end to the circularity because no one, at least his children, are not going in circles anymore. There is a direct future, an eschatology that they can hold on to. Okay, so how one relates to time then is completely shattered according to this narrative in and through Christ. Okay, so the key then, at least in terms of what I want to read in here and argue, is that Christianity, and again in that sort of loaded term, but I suppose I should say that when I say Christianity, I'm talking about a Reformed Christianity that is not Catholicism that comes after the Reformation, but would side in with folks like Augustine. Okay, in Christianity, there is what is often referred to as the yet but not yet. Okay, that yet and not yet is really important to understand what Heidegger is doing. And so my point is that he's, in some ways, I don't even want to say that he's borrowing for it. I think that'll be a fair statement for me to make because of how much he's heavily influenced by theology. But even if he's never read this stuff, there's a clear parallel that one can see in terms of what Heidegger is writing and what one finds in the Christian literature. Okay, so the yet but not yet is this unfinished sense of what it means to be, and this is precisely, like I said, what I try to work through in some ways, at least, in the homelessness of being. The unfinished sense is one that one is. What is one? One is, according to the narrative, a child of God, and thus reconciled to God through Christ, yet not fully complete and not fully completed, because one is still in the flesh. So there is this immense struggle between being in the spirit and being in the flesh. Okay? That is the sort of yet but not yet. So the effect of this then is manifold. Okay? One of them is the way knowledge is put forward. Okay? That, in other words, one has access to knowledge, but it's not complete. And one knows, but one does not fully know. And I'm going to read one statement here from Corinthians, but when I do so, just keep in mind the very thing I started with, which is Job. And I said, in the book of Job, as the narrative goes, God enters at the very end. And when he enters at the end, he basically declares, what I want you to know, you will know. Okay? What I don't want you to know, you will not know. Okay? This is what Paul writes. And he's writing this to the church of the church of Corinth, 1 Corinthians 13 and 12. Okay, quote, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I am also known. Okay, so in other words, according to the Christian narrative, we're reconciled, you're saved, you know, but not yet. Okay, there is that. That's the future that, according to the Christian narrative, one looks forward to, where the circularity of life is completely shut. Okay, that's the distinction. So the point of all this then is in Christianity, what one finds essentially is a folding together of past, present, and future. Okay, and a folding together that has the future no longer subjected to circularity as its distinct gaze. Okay, so I've already mentioned that Heidegger's exposition of time and temporality sees the folding of the past, present, and future, the ecstasies of time, as he said, into one now that is already in a future. Okay, but not realized. And so I hope it's clear that what Heidegger is putting forward is in many ways, it runs parallel to what one finds in Judeo-Christianity. Okay, so it's not possible to think of time in a linear fashion, but of simultaneity, yes, and that is evident, as I want to say, in Christianity. So, if it is the case that one can read time, I'm just checking my time, and temporality in terms of Heidegger, in parallel with Judeo-Christianity, okay, I want to suggest that that theme gets carried further into the mature Heidegger in terms of how he comes to understand truth, okay, which will frame his understanding of time, which obviously frames his understanding of being. So the enfolding of temporality found in Christian eschatology informs Heidegger's theorization of time. Okay, and it is equally possible to see the way Heidegger's reading of aletheia as unconcealment is also found in Judeo-Chrisitanity. Okay, now the word aletheia from Greek means truth or disclosure. Okay, and the word aletheia is paramount to the later and mature Heidegger, who basically puts forth that concept, at least as far as I remember, in his 1962 book on time and being. So it's not a reversal of being in time from 1927. In many ways, it's a continuation, but a refinement. Okay, and I think the play on the word there, the inversion, is very important. Being in time, on time and being. Okay, so to appreciate this, though, very quickly, I want to talk about the way this notion of being gets emphasized in Heidegger scholarship over time. Okay, now, if there's any place where there will be flattening, it's going to be right now, okay, because I'm going to do this rapidly for about 40 years of Heidegger in about 2 minutes, okay? That's my excuse, I suppose, okay? So the clearest shift one finds in Heidegger's turn, which he himself espouses, okay, is in the import of Dasein in being and time. Okay, so remember, Dasein is mind, it's being there, okay, to its subordination in on time and being, okay? You will find, however, this shift taking place even as early as the mid-1940s when he writes, I don't want to say writes the letter on humanism, because that's really a response to a series of questions that he received, but you can think of it sort of an essay. So what one will find in being in time is the imperative to put being on the intellectual map, right? What Nietzsche had forgotten, Plato had forgotten, so on and so forth. As such, in this journey from the ontic to the ontological, Heidegger writes Dasein all the way from its preparatory work to the discovery of being. What I want to say then is what's important about being in time for Heidegger is this. It is Dasein that is paramount to being. Okay? And remember, Dasein is Heidegger's notion of the human way of being. So he puts the human at the emphasis of how to understand being. Okay, so without Dasein, a Dasein that has as its basis its own existence and a desire to know itself, being is irrelevant. Okay, being only comes into the picture because Dasein seeks to know being, and as such, being is contingent upon Dasein's desire to know and bring to the fore being. What I want to say, the immense amount of flattening, is that over time, okay, the position of being's subordinated position to Dasein gets reformulated, where being comes to stand over Dasein, fully brought to light in his On Time and Being. Okay, so in that span of 1927 to 1962, you can easily trace this sort of significant shift. And I'm going to read at the very outset, not at the very outset, but page 2, essentially, of On Time and Being. This is what Heidegger says, okay? Quote, we want to say something about the attempt to think being without regard to its being grounded in terms of beings. The attempt to think being without beings, okay, becomes necessary because otherwise it seems to me there is no longer any possibility of explicitly bringing into the view being. And the sentence continues, okay? The point I want to make is this. From about the 1940s on, towards the end of his career, I suppose, if one wants to call that, the emphasis given to being shifts and shifts significantly. And it transpires in a particular manner where the notion of being gives, es gibt, okay, which is both there are, but at the same time also it gives, comes to connect itself with Dasein in the sense of being gives and gives to Dasein. And so therefore being and Dasein get forever linked. So what is it that being gives according to this narrative? Being gives truth, okay? And it gives truth by giving itself. So already the point I want to make is that truth resides in being and gets cemented as such in On Time and Being. And it gives that truth to Dasein, where truth also resides. Okay, so there's a sort of revelatory aspect that I'm trying to sort of at least, if not trace, at least sort of underline. And the point I want to make is that this revelation of truth by being to Dasein has obviously very uncanny parallels with Christianity, okay, which Heidegger, I want to say, is quite in some ways influenced by. So in order to put this together, I just want to look at two things. One is Heidegger's reading of aletheia. and then show that, if time permits, as one would find it in some passages, at least in the New Testament. Okay? As I mentioned, the Greek word for truth and disclosure is aletheia. Okay? But Heidegger, okay, is going to go ahead and not translate aletheia as truth or disclosure. He's going to go ahead and translate aletheia as unconcealment. Okay? And so it's related to truth, but this is how he goes about it. So what I want to do is I want to focus on Heidegger's translation of the word aletheia, the Greek word for truth or disclosure. And I want to show that Heidegger's translation of aletheia, not as truth, but as unconcealment, is in keeping with what one finds in Judeo-Christianity. Okay? Where aletheia is the unconcealment of the truth that comes to life via the word. Okay? There is a somewhat complicated process by which Heidegger comes to equate aletheia to unconcealment. I'm going to skip all that, but I just want to make a few points to push the argument forward, I suppose. One is that Heidegger speaks of what he calls presencing. And that's important because he says presencing permits being to be unconcealed. And the unconcealment shows the presencing of being as permanent and eternal. So what he says, quote, is to presence means to last, end quote. Now, here's what I read as important in that. To say that being lasts, to say that being endures, is to say that it is not in time, it is outside of time. And as such, it's not temporal, because only that which is in time is temporal. As such, if being is not temporal because it is not in time and thus not subjected to time, then accordingly being is not perishable. It doesn't perish. Okay? It always thus is. It always was and always is. And so even on this ground alone of how we come to read this, I think there is a clear parallel to Christianity, a Christian God, and in particular Christian eschatology. Okay? The second point I want to make in this, so the first one is the presencing. The second point I want to make is that Heidegger appears to go beyond the Greek thinkers, the pre-Socratics, okay, and talk about being as a yielding, being as giving, okay? And this is where the notion of the es gibt, it gives, comes into play. And it's not just that being is a giving, but his argument is that being is also sending, okay? So being gives, and without being, it is not possible, Heidegger's argument now goes, to have being. So there is that sort of reversal, okay? Based upon this, Heidegger wants to come to make the claim that being and truth are one and the same. And if being and truth are one and the same, then he wants to make the claim that aletheia is essentially an unconcealment over time. Okay, so aletheia is an unconcealment, which according to Heidegger is, quote, the opening which first grants being and thinking and their presencing to and for each other. Okay? In what is essentially my last part here, I want to try to make a claim that Heidegger's reading of aletheia as unconcealment is drawn from much more than the pre-Socratics. I want to make the claim that it's actually drawn from Judeo-Christian. Okay, from the very start of Job, which lays down the sort of prophetic revelation to come, all the way to Revelation. But I'm going to actually draw from the Gospel of John, just very briefly. Okay? And the reason I'm going to draw from the Gospel of John is because it speaks of the notion of truth repeatedly. And I think one can actually trace the notion of truth here as unconcealed, as a reveal. Okay, as an unveiling, as an unpeeling, if you will. Okay, so I'm just going to take two verses from here, but I'm going to start at the very beginning of John, John 1:1. Okay, this is what it says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. End quote. Okay, the word here is capitalized. It appears 3 times. So in the beginning was the Word was with God. Also capitalized, the Word was God. Okay? The first and explicit, there are several things, of course, I want to focus on. One, clearly, is the explicit reference to time, okay? To a beginning that cannot be dated, because according to the narrative, God is timeless and it's outside time. But in a moment of revelation, okay, what in the Heideggerian sort of language is unconcealing, locates God not just at the very center, but at the very start, okay? And this can be traced, for example, into Old Testament literature. If one, for example, thinks of Isaiah, there it's written, I am the first, I am the last. Okay? So it's that sort of, at least in the Christian literature, the sort of fulfillment of it. Okay? So then already the point I want to make is that the relation between past, present, and future, in some ways at least, is leveled. Okay? And it's enfolded in and by God. Okay, so in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So according to this argument, you have Christ. So the word here is a reference to Christ, okay, capitalized. Christ was in the beginning itself, from the very start, okay. In other places in John, he equates himself to the I am, okay. He tells the Jewish people, before Abraham, I am. And I am is the word in English for the Hebrew word Yahweh. Okay, so for example, if you think of when Moses asks God, who do I say is sending me to go to the people of Israel? The response is, I am. Okay, so Jesus' response in that context is, before Abraham, I am. So at the very start is the Word was with God, and then the Word is God. So it's this sort of unveiling, if you will, or unpeeling of the prophetic word that is coming to practice and coming to effect in Christ. Okay, and the point I want to make is this notion of unconcealing that Heidegger is drawing from can easily be seen in Judeo-Christianity. Okay, so the notion of the unconcealment of truth becomes very clear a few verses later in John, and this is the last one that I want to do. Okay, so I'm going to read from verses 4 and 5. Okay, still chapter 1. Quote, in him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. End quote. And I'll read this several times in a second. Okay. And then later it says of Christ, quote, the true light which gives light. So I want to focus on an important trope that is frequently found in John, and that is between light and darkness. It crops up all the time. In the most straightforward sense, okay, the duality between light and darkness is a duality between good and evil, okay, or a duality between righteousness and sin, or a duality between God and his adversary. So think where I started with the book of Job. Okay. Most specifically, the duality between light and darkness also points to a duality between knowledge and wisdom. I'm putting them together, though they're not exactly the same thing, versus ignorance or truth versus falsity. Okay, so knowledge, wisdom versus ignorance, truth versus falsity. Okay, and this can be appreciated, I think, when considering that the Greek word for darkness is skotos, and the word skotos here refers to obscurity. Okay, there is a particular obscuring that has taken place that is slowly being unveiled. So goes the argument. Right? So to be in the dark then means to be in falsity. It's not to be in the truth. In other words, to not have that truth revealed. Okay? So as such, in the quote which I just read, which I want to read again, in him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. The word comprehend here, as in the darkness did not comprehend it, in the Greek is from katalambano, which is to lay hold of, to seize, to arrest, to capture. Okay? So as such, the darkness did not comprehend it. At its heart, I want to say, is not conveying that the darkness did not or cannot comprehend or understand the truth. That much is clear elsewhere in the Bible. Rather, the statement underlines something much more forceful. And what it underlines, I want to say, is that the darkness cannot defeat or overcome the light, okay? Or that the light cannot be overthrown or defeated by the darkness. So the truth then, which always was, according to John 1:1, right, and will be in the Word, as the Word, is being unconcealed over time, where darkness cannot understand, no defeat, no overcome. So from the very start of Judeo-Christianity, which we date in Job, all the way to the end, what you see is this sort of unconcealment of the truth, where how one equates to and relates to time is changing. That's the point, in some ways, that I want to make. Okay, so the word which exists from the beginning enters time. As it enters time, it ruptures the circle of damnation and eternity and damnation. With it, it liberates by bringing forth unconcealing the truth and the light in the word, which was from the very beginning. Okay, this revealing is unconcealing, and unconcealing that has been laid out via the prophetic voice in terms of the rupturing of the circularity of life. So I just want to close then by saying just the following brief remarks. To me, the Gospel of John is, I'm drawing upon it because I think it evidences a tradition of unconcealment that one finds in Judeo-Christian. Okay, from Job to Christ, and in the very question of being as truth that is a product of concealment, also found in Judeo-Christian. So Heidegger's sort of prophetic mission then starts in a particular way and leads forward. My reading of Heidegger and why I think Heidegger is important is not because Heidegger himself is necessarily important, but I can read Heidegger as in some ways an icon of an intellectual history that is trying to chart what it means to be. And that history, I'm saying, has in some ways at least as its foundation this Christianity and Christian eschatology. So I will leave it at that, and thank you for your. Thank you.
Time for questions and comments. Yeah,
thank you so much for that. That was really wonderful. And I haven't been Heidegger for a while, but you brought a lot back for me. So thanks for that. My question's about the figure of the circle that you bring in. Because I think I'm convinced by the connection you're making between Heidegger and Christian theology, but then I'm interested more, or to hear you talk more about why the circle, because the reading, if I understood it, was there's sort of like the unrighteous caught in the circle in this loop, and then when God enters, there's this sort of, the circle is broken, I think, as you put it. And I guess I'm wondering, there's a part of me is like, is the circle, it's not exactly like a linear, like all of a sudden there's a linearity as opposed to the circle, right? But is that just a different kind of circle? Is it really broken? So I guess my question is kind of about that choice of shape or figure and how, to what degree, maybe you could just say more about why the circle.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. The circle can capture well the duality that one finds in Christianity. I cannot speak for other religions because I don't know that, but know it well. This I do. For both one who is, at least in Judaism, a child of God, and then later in Christianity, one who becomes, is a believer. So there's a child of God in terms of the nation, and then there's a child of God, depending again on the Christianity in terms of what one buys into the doctrine of predestination or election and so on. You're right. It's not a linearity in that sort of straightening sense, but the circularity captures a particular problem of going round and round and round, which I think is, if you even just sort of painting it as I'm going round and round and round, already sort of captures a very defeatist sort of attitude, right? Which is broken, but not for those who are not saved by God. So there, it's just still going round and round and round. For those who are, the argument is that round and round and round is very different in eternity. It's no longer just a sort of going round and round and round. So I suppose obviously it's not a literal circle. It's the imagery of what it captures which is what I'm saying. I don't think it's aimless, but it's certainly futile. Okay, and so according to the Judeo-Christian narrative, Satan is overthrown by God. So his wanderings, all of them with purpose, are still futile because good will triumph over them. So for those then who, let's say, believe in Christ, as the narrative goes, it's no longer a circular sort of going around without purpose, without direction, aimlessly. There is a hope to look forward. And I think the clearest example of that is, and Heidegger talks about this as well, I didn't, but I can talk about it, is the notion of death, right? Because for those who believe that the concept of death has a very different understanding, I suppose, for lack of a better word that I can think of, because it's not a death per se, because one perishes, but one lives. That's that. So the circularity, the futility of going round and round in that sort of fashion is completely shattered. So I think that's how I would respond to your question here. Thank you.
Actually, I think you really got very interesting. My question is about how Heidegger can design a new philosophy of history. So at the end of your talk, you characterize what you're doing as intellectual history. So would you say you apply Heidegger's idea of temporality, simultaneity, and circularity into the intellectual history you're doing? Because given the sense that when you don't think about history as sequential events, and each point in time, that kind of simultaneity and simultaneity yet and not yet, right? In that sense, can you still conceptualize, just like you did, right? You actually specify specific time in 1927 and 1962, how in each point Heidegger could operate and draw the resources from his traditions at the same time, not yet doing that. Is that, so my question should be, first of all, according to Heidegger's framework, how one could understand the past and not as a linear development, and how you actually understand Heidegger's intellectual development in a similar fashion.
How I understand Heidegger's understanding of the history of, let's say, intellectualism or Western philosophy.
That's one. And how you understand Heidegger's development of the, for example, from the very beginning and then reverse it to the thing becomes dominant of the design, right, in about 30 years time, so 40 years of time.
Right. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. So one of the things that I haven't touched on in this talk, but is, will inform hopefully what will come out of it, is this sort of trajectory in Heidegger, as which I said, is he starts off very clearly claiming that he's been influenced by theology. Okay. By the way, we should, I think, make a distinction as well. If I can borrow from something like Heidegger, there is obviously the theology of the scholastic theology, where one doesn't buy into the Word of God as the Word of God, but one studies it as in that way, as opposed to one who is a theologian who believes that the Word of God is the Word. Okay? I would think that if Heidegger is studying to be a priest, then he believes that this is the Word of God. And he gets sort of, in some ways, disillusioned and dissatisfied with that sort of process. And so, from his early career, university career, I suppose early 1920, maybe probably so much before then, let's say 1915 or something like that, till about 1920, he's heavily grounded in this theology, starting with Catholicism, moving into Protestants. Oh, I characterize that shift that comes is essentially, if I can borrow from Luther, who is heavily influenced, right? Because Luther's concept and conception of sin is something that grounds Heidegger, in particular, the notion of the fallen, right? Which one finds that. But I think in some ways, I want to make the claim, even though I haven't done it here, is that one can read Heidegger as moving from what Luther would call a theology of the cross to a theology of glory that removes God from its center and puts men at its center, which is what you find in Being and Time. Okay? And over the course of that, he tends to completely sort of lose faith, I want to make a claim, in that theology of glory. I think partly where we haven't talked about this as well, is his sort of involvement or flirtation with the National Socialist Party. In some ways is to address this problem of European nihilism that he sees coming his way. And he sees in that party some hope of rescuing a nation, which he gives up in the air, right? But he moves from a theology of the cross to a theology of glory. And I think over the course of his time, post sort of Letter of Humanism in 1946, and it's definitely culminating in 1962 in On Time and Being, but certainly there is no doubt, based upon the words that he utters in the interview he gives, it's sort of generally known as a Spiegel interview, I think it is, 1966, which he himself wanted to be his final words, which show a complete dissatisfaction and realization with philosophy. So he moves, I think, away from what, to draw upon Luther, would be a theology of glory, back to, in some ways, a theology of the cross. And I say this because what happens in the interview, which he himself orchestrated, and so they run through the whole sort of issue of, how do you join the party and so on and so forth. And he comes to a very specific place in speaking of technology, not just a technology, but as a technique in terms of how we organize ourselves, to say that philosophy has just no basis and has lost all means of providing solutions to essentially the issues that Germany in particular faces. And he ends off with, what is essentially a very shocking statement when he says, only a God can save us. My point is not that he's saying that only God can save us is a literal God. That is not what I'm saying. I don't think that's what he means. But I think what he's getting at is, if one says only God can save us, then there has to be something to be saved from. There has to be some sort of issue there. And I think part of the way, at least I read it, is Heidegger's coming to the realization that the mess that we're in, partly through philosophy itself, cannot bring about any sort of meaningful change. And he sort of, as he does with much of his writing, leaves you in that sort of cliff kind of there to sort of figure things out. So that's how I would respond to the question of his sort of trajectory, or his evolvement, if you will, of his history of the understanding of being. And which is why I'm saying, I don't think one can make the claim that he's not influenced by Christianity, because it is there heavily. How much of it one wants to pull out of it is a different sort of question, right? I suppose, we are always sort of, implicated in our work, right? So, if you talk about a female scholar, you say it's very difficult to remove what it means to be a woman from that argument, just like it's very difficult to remove what it means to be a colored man from that argument. But given my sort of personal walk in faith and my faith in the gospel of Christ, I was very drawn, when reading Heidegger, to the profound similarities that I saw that hadn't been sort of given its due, right? And so I think one of the things that I want to work out is, scholars often say, there's a sort of secularized Kierkegaard, or secularized Christianity. I want to try to work out what does that mean to promote a sort of secularized philosophy or vision, and this distinction, between a theology of the cross and theology of glory, which I'm still sort of working through. I think it's helpful to understand that sort of shift, the turn within turns. That's how I would respond to your question.
Yeah. Well, can I respond?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not entirely surprised that Heidegger for its intellectual resource from the Christian traditions in that sense, because that tradition is always there, and he was brought up in that tradition, right? So, but you also mentioned that he was responding to so many circumstantial contemporary events, such as Nietzsche's nihilism, and he's trying to respond to that. Why wouldn't you say that response, that sort of coping with his contemporary ideas, triggers more of his problematics, and he just unconsciously maybe draw from the traditions in order to deal with?
By which you mean that the original sort of grounding that laid his work in, so let's say before the 1920s, is what he comes back to in some ways in sort of unconscious, even ideological? Where would that, am I reading a question?
Yeah, okay, yes. Go with that.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
The other argument is this, right? My point, again, I don't think there's sort of controversy in the point I want to make here, is that much of Western philosophy is heavily grounded in Christianity. Okay, Nietzsche being so if I can't make a convincing argument with Heidegger, then I can't make a convincing argument. Anyway. But if we go back to Nietzsche cannot be Nietzsche. Nietzsche cannot write what he's writing about without Christianity. Right? Even if as negation, right? Because I talked about the circle in Job, right? To me, at least as I read it, Nietzsche comes to put it back, right? He removes, so a Christ who has come in and interrupted and erupted that circle. And he replaces it with an eternal recurrence. So if your point is, is it almost not so academic that Heidegger would go back to it? I think, yeah. I think, he's probably not able to leave that sort of tradition and upbringing. The other thing to mention is, when he passed, he was adamant that that there be a funeral for him at a Catholic church, right? So, how far he actually moved from it or not, I don't know. I don't know. But my point is, like, when you raise Nietzsche, I can raise others as well who are grounded in that sort of tradition, right? And then the issue becomes whether one wants out of that and must work heavily to move philosophy out of that, or whether one is okay with that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Other questions?
If Aletheia is like meant to be connected to Christianity, why doesn't he say so? Why does he draw from Attic Greek and not from Koine? Isn't the Greek world an alternative tradition, a separate pillar of Western civilization that's distinct from Judeo-Christian world? Aren't there also notions of collapsing past, present, and future that stand completely outside of Judeo-Christianity? So most obviously, Plato's concept of the idea as the forms, as existing outside of temporal change, being eternal and not subject to modification over time. And that this is the attempt to synthesize Platonic idealism with Christianity is explained Augustine, which is where you get the introduction of some of the ideas into Christian theology, not so much backdated into things like the Old Testament, but into Christian theology as an attempt to reconcile those. And that's a more obvious route for explaining the introduction of those ideas for Heidegger, or at least they're more self-evidently what he thought, given that he draws from classical Greek, Attic Greek, to derive his concepts for this.
Why wouldn't I find in Heidegger Aletheia tied directly to Christianity?
If he thought it was a Christian then why didn't he say so?
Sure.
Why does he expressly say, should say non-Christian?
let me say, no, thank you. Thank you for your question. And it's a good one, too. I think the first thing is, and I'll ask you a question second. The first thing is, I think the crux of what I'm trying to do can be made without making the case that Heidegger is saying explicitly. I'm not saying he's not, I'm saying explicitly that I'm drawing this from Christian literature. Okay? Because my argument is that one can read in a parallel between the two. Okay? So that's the first. But let me take on your question, because I think it's useful for me to think through. So we know, for example, in the two texts that he writes that are directly grounded in Christianity, one where he draws from the letter of Galatians, and one where he draws from the letter of Thessalonians, and he's drawing from these largely because these are believed to be some of the earliest writings found in the New Testament. So it's called the Phenomenology of Religious Life, and then he follows it up obviously later with Phenomenology and Theology, and that in 1927, I think, is where he explicitly as well renounces that, he's no longer doing theology. But I think one can find in that earlier work as well this sort of argument that aletheia as unconcealment of the truth. I don't know whether I would necessarily say that one cannot find. Maybe one cannot find it explicitly, but there is, I think, implicitly something there. The more pressing thing for me of your question, which is, but you find this, or perhaps we do not find this also in Greek antiquity, right? Particularly, for example, and you and I have had this chat before, in terms of the pre-Socratics. Yes, I think you can. But as you and I have also sort of chatted there, you get this sort of, in the sort of circularity, you get a profound sort of dysfunction that is taking place in terms of, so if you take someone like Heraclitus, the opposites are the same and so on and so forth. So Heraclitus, we've talked about this, says no man steps in the same river, but at the same time he says things like, things go in circles all the time, right? So you find the fragments themselves are heavily disorganized. And in some ways, I don't want to use this word, but it looks like profoundly contradictory, right? So I think there is a difference between that sort of circularity that tends to go round and round, that itself professes that opposites are the same. For Heraclitus, for example, says, in the circumference of the circle, the beginning and the end are the same. Or, when you go up and down, it's the same way. Okay? So my point is, if you want to call that a paradox, then even in that paradox, it seems to me that much of the truth is also grounded in a certain sense of confusion. My argument is that in what one finds, at least in the Hebrew tradition, is a very definitive break in that, which obviously comes before that, depending on when you date it. So I think yours is a very fair question. It's something for me to obviously think about, but I don't know whether I would say that it's the same.
Well, I don't think it is the same, but there's let me play I don't know if we can play. Let's say Nietzsche. Let me play Nietzsche for a minute. They're not the same, but it's because the Christian tradition is worse. The Greeks have a better concept, and the reason is that this is Augustine's problem of trying to reconcile the Platonic notion of a good with the Christian concept of God. And you imply that there's a parallel, because both imply the idea that what is and will be has always already been. It's always so. There's a kind of eternity in the concept of God, and so time and history is just the unfolding of what was already the case.
Okay.
Because God exists previous to this, God is already posited at the beginning, and so everything that's happening is just the unfolding of what had already taken place. So there's a collapse in past, present, and future. And obviously says that similar to the Platonic concept of the good, because the idea in Plato also exists outside of time. It is not changeable over time. It is an eternal concept, and therefore collapses past, present, and future. But the problem, and so there's a kind of superficial comparison between the two, if you want, in the idea of unconcealment, because truth is just revealing what was already the case. So it can be defined as sort of unconcealment. So the antonym to truth, ignorance, is not a ontologically real thing. It doesn't really exist. It's just the absence. It's the absence of something, not a presence of something, right?
Okay.
So in the Greek notion of falsehood or badness, falsehood and badness are not sort of ontologically real things. They're just the absence of that. And you're saying there's something similar in the Christian notion of the antonym of God or goodness and evil, sin, and so on. But the problem is, this is Augustine's problem, is that they aren't parallel, and that Christianity has a problem that Greek philosophy doesn't have. And it creates a big problem for Christian theology, which is, where does evil come from? Because God isn't like the Platonic notion of the good, because God is the creator of all things. So God must also be the originator of evil, sin. But that seems to be a puzzle then, right? And so when you quoted Job, and God asking Satan, from where do you come? I thought you were going to say that the reason why it's this problem, or the circularity, is the answer to the question, if Satan is asked, from where do you come? The answer has to be from God. Satan must come from God, because God is the originator of all things. So Augustine and the Christian tradition has to explain, in a sense, the existence of evil and how it can derive from, in some sense, God. But that's not true of the Greek notion of ignorance. Ignorance and falsehood doesn't, in a sense, derive from the concept of the good, because the good is not like God, which is not the ontological sort of beginning and originating of all things. They're just conceptual distinctions. So the Platonists can say that untruth is not ontologically a real thing. It's just non-truth. But that's not the same thing as a Christian notion of sin or a Christian notion of evil, because those things do have to, in a sense, exist, and they must, in some sense or another, derive from God, or God is origin. So that's the puzzle of Augustine, and that's why Augustine can't reconcile. And that's why people like Nietzsche say that's why we have to go before Christianity, reach all the way back to the Greeks, because if you go down that route, you just cannot. So the distinction, the Christian distinction between good and evil, is not the Greek distinction between good and bad. The Greek distinction between good and bad is different from the Christian distinction between good and evil. That's why beyond good and evil is trying to get before Christianity precisely that the distinctions between the Greek concepts of good and bad are not the same as the Christian notions of good and evil. And so we can't just say that aletheia, the Greek notion of aletheia, is the same as a Christian notion of unconcealing of God's purpose, because they're qualitatively different. But for Nietzsche, that's why Christianity is worse off than the Greeks. And arguably, that's why Heidegger also goes to the Greeks rather than becoming a Christian theologian.
Okay. That's something for me to think about. I agree with you that in the genealogy of morals and what preceded before, between good and bad, yes, it's from behind than before. I give you that. That's a very fair point you make. But I still am not, I don't know whether the qualitative difference should. The question is, can I read into Judeo-Christianity a particular unveiling? Obviously, which is the direction of the path that I'm going into, or have gone. And I don't know whether that is necessarily an unfair sort of reading. But I think that the point that you're making is, something for me to think about, which is very important, is this sort of is the sort of puzzle. And I think partly why I guess I'm interested in the puzzle that you're talking about is because it's a very puzzle that Heidegger then himself falls into over the course of his sort of thing. And so if your case is that one cannot find that in Christianity, which is why Heidegger sort of renounces it. I find it interesting in terms of why he comes to say the same about philosophy itself. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but more to say that it's something that I sort of have to think through more. But thank you. Aditya, from the tradition of Genesis in the beginning itself, to what I read in terms of John, which starts with in the beginning, is itself a profound tradition of unveiling, which goes before, in some cases at least, to some of the. So I don't know. It's more to think about, more to talk about, as I try to lay this out. So I thank you for that. And look forward to more, hopefully. Yeah.
Maybe a related question. Sure. That is I think it's important to try to understand the reason why these people, Nietzsche and Heidegger, but in a very different way, they wanted to, or they had to go back to pre-Christianity. So, and one can say the pagan circular eye is a time ascribed in the cosmos, in the order. Things make sense because there is a cosmos, there is an order, and experiences make sense because they are ordered. But then in Christianity, that order and that circularity is broken. And there is order, but the order is now something that transcends what we can achieve, what we can do, what we can understand. It transcends our experience. And then I would say Augustine's dilemma, intentio versus extensio. So if we live in time, we are dispersed. Nothing makes sense. Fortunately, there is the intentio, the vertical, and transcendence can give some sense to our action. Then I'm galloping centuries, but then even this idea of the transcendence is lost, and this is basically how Heidegger began the concept of time. Modern science, technologies, Einstein, relativity, and then he has to reorient himself. This is one of my first points. So I think Heidegger raised the question about how can we orient ourselves in a world in which order, meaning, sense, and even transcendence are lost. Mm-hmm. And then he doesn't want to go in let's say, let me put it this way. So he sees the problem of relativism and he sees the problem of the universal categories at the same time. And then I go back to these universal categories in a second. And then he tries to do something very specific. He tries to temporalize time from the uniqueness of your specific death. So I think something that is going on when he temporalizes time from your death is a way to temporalize time from something that is a unique, specific, individual. It's your death. It's not something that you can universalize or impostatize in a metaphysical, technical concept. Is your existential death. And then I think this is the way you can see Heidegger, who basically is trying to find the sense, our existence, but without universal categories. So in a certain way, so my first question is, Heidegger, and is a constant going back to Heidegger as a symptom, our symptom, to try to think without the universal categories or by challenging universal categories. And this is what Heidegger tried to do with it's a temporalization of time from the perspective of something unique in your death and so on. And also this, and that I think is a Robert point, and there is an allergy to a certain kind of a Christianity. Then he has to go back to pre-Christianity, paganism. Why? Because the Christianity gave us something universal. Men are created equal, and Heidegger is totally aware that for 2,000 years, men believe that the men are created equal. And then he saw, from his perspective, the catastrophe of this assumption. A catastrophe that began with the French Revolution and it ended with the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's a political, so in this highly conceptual, abstract philosophy, there is a lot of politics. It's a war against the universal categories because what he calls Western metaphysics is exactly this possibility to reinforce equalities, to reinforce something that Heidegger politically hated. So, and then I will say, at the end of this trajectory, his representation of the entire history of Western metaphysics is done from the perspective of what he wants to demolish, the possibility of thinking with the universal categories and equality, because the two things are connected. And he saw the connection because he read Kant.
Yeah. I'm not sure if when you say, his temporalization of time draws from one's death, that sounds more Nietzschean.
Death.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay, that's where I was very confused.
So he's on top.
Yeah.
Sorry, Max. Sorry. Part of the issue here, and I think there has been some confusion in Heidegger's literature, is exactly what he means by death. Okay? So part of that is, and he distinguishes between death in terms of perishing, and then he distinguishes between death that comes with what is essentially a possibility of normal possibilities. That I get looks very much like death, but the key in Heidegger's philosophy is that with death one still continues in life, and I don't mean in the afterlife. Okay? In other words, it's the realization that one has no more possibilities. So yes, it's an actual death of mortality that he's speaking about, but it's in a much broader sense of understanding that one will die at one point, and then how one lives from there. So is that the sort of sense that you're talking about when he temporalizes time in relation to that sort of death, not the perishing, but the broad sort of thing? They are related, but
It's an insistence, especially in the concept of time, is an insistence on the uniqueness. Authenticity,
right,
if you want to use
yes,
terminology of your own death.
Yes.
Something
yes.
that we all die.
Yes.
But we don't share our death.
Right.
This is mine, and this is unique,
yes,
and this is authentic because it's mine. Now the point is what if I temporalize time and my existence from the perspective of my unique death? And I think this is what Heidegger was doing in the concept of time, in order to do two things simultaneously, to attack universal categories and to find a way out from modern science, Einstein relativism.
Okay, that's a fair point. I'll address I suppose the point that you also made in relation to that, which is Heidegger and politics, and that politics is one that you said wants to see equality.
I think it's a battle against universal categories, is a battle against equality that is implied. Against equality, because both are implied in the history of Christianity.
I don't know. The first thing I should say is I don't know whether in the history of Christianity one can necessarily make an argument that equality is implied. Certainly in terms of the the sort of history of Judaism, that is not, one doesn't find that. And then it depends also in terms of how the sort of Christian, in terms of how it branches out, is taken. So if one sort of looks into what I suppose what one would call reform theology that emphasizes the notion of predestination, then the equality is there on earth. But in terms of what is looked upon later, it's not necessarily an equal thing, right? Because salvation is to the elect. So I don't know whether I would necessarily say that it's already grounded in and implied in that sense. It would depend on which sort of perspective you would take, whether you want to take what is essentially called the Calvinist sort of doctrine, or whether one would take an Arminian sort of position on that. So that's the way I would sort of look at it. So I don't know whether we're starting from sort of two different positions there.
Yeah, there is so Renan that is more famous because of his discourse on what is a nation. He also wrote a life of Jesus, and it's a fascinating book because talking about the life of Jesus is citing the Gospels all the time, and once in a while you have some parallel between Jesus, the Christians, the early Christianity, and the French Revolution that he hated. Obviously, he's a conservative. So what I want to say is that in the 18th, 19th century, among the conservatives, that was a commonplace to think that the French Revolution, this radical idea of equality, egalitarianism, has a Christian roots. And I think in some attempts, conservative attempts to go before Christianity, is an attempt to skip that possibility for egalitarianism that the Christianity made possible. Impossible in a way that can be universal. Again, a universal category that you want to ban. So what I insinuate is that this highly sophisticated philosophy is politically oriented.
Yes, I mean, let me say two things. Thank you, by the way, for that additional things for me to think about. I'll get to politics. There was no doubt about that. And it is not something that I'm trying to sort of muzzle in the talk of, just I hope clear now. But I think there is a very important distinction to be made in the type of equality that you're trying to either extrapolate or cultivate from Judeo-Christianity, because obviously I say Judeo-Christianity because one cannot think of Christianity without that history. And the equality there is one that is first originally very definitively stated for the nation, for a nation, okay? Which then becomes, I suppose, if you want to use the word universalized, in terms of not just a nation, but for all nations. That's this sort of universality that happens in Christ. So it is a fundamental difference in terms of the equality that is originally propounded in Judaism, Egypt was a particular nation. Okay. Now, granted though, in the Judeo history, when one looks at the literature, one can see already traces of the opening that is there, right? Of that revealing. So that's there. But I'm saying in terms of the foregoing sort of narrative, it is a narrative that is specifically for one nation, which is then broken and opened for all nations. Okay, but the question then becomes whether it's, again, like I said, it depends on which sort of branch that you take. So the idea of Arminianism is quite new in the sense that it's a reaction in some ways to Calvin. The Calvin essentially is a synthesis of what the debate between Augustine and Pelagius was in the 4th or 5th century, which sort of laid to rest that idea. So there is a, if one calls a choosing, but not of a nation, but of an elect, then that's very different. So I don't know at this point, at least, whether I'm fully in agreement with that notion of equality that you're speaking about, because I think it is different. It's from nation to all nations, but then within that, it depends on the sort of perspective that you take of how it goes about. That's the first thing. There is no doubt that, any text is politically wrong. Right? When he writes of Heidegger's political ontology, he makes this claim as well, as many have, and others have. So I think, I couldn't sit here and say that when Heidegger is writing there is in the political program that grounds his philosophy, if you could say that, though I think about most philosophers. And like I said, as I mentioned, even though in passing, he's very sort of venturing into the 1930s of the National Socialist Party and embracing what he saw in Hitler, at least for a while, is politically grounded. There is no doubt. When you look at his reformulates at Frege, when he took it up, it's a very politically motivated and grounded argument of what even education ought to be. It was just not just a sort of intellectual argument, but it was that that people have to work with their hands and that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean that is I definitely am in agreement with you on that. I'm not minimizing in one bit that sort of argument. Now, if it's the case that in my talk that it sort of looks like I'm trying to separate out the intellectual with the political, and that is an issue. That's not where I'm going. They have to be sort of pulled together. So that is something to think about. But I'm on your side in that. It's absolutely politically motivated, grounded, even to disdain. So
could I add something to you?
Yeah.
I was somewhat side with your interpretation, meaning there are probably all sorts of different impulses throughout even early Christianity and Christian tradition, and its own big thing. You'll definitely find impulses of equality and inequality, right? And certainly it shouldn't be very controversial to say that if Heidegger disliked certain parts and liked others, but I think that's the case probably with every reader of Christianity or whatever text in culture, then certainly the parts regarding equality were for more modern interpretations of Christian tradition as very much connected to some sort of equality. Those parts he certainly disliked. For example, with how he reads Hölderlin, and there is a text of Hölderlin, a very short one, called Communism of Spirits. And back in the 30s, 40s, it was very much debated, even later also, whether this is a text of Hölderlin even. It recounts a discussion of two Christian followers somewhere near a old German church. Those Christian followers is actually Hölderlin and Hegel under different names. And it was a sketch for a bigger work of Hölderlin. It was debated at the time whether this sketch is by Hölderlin. And when Heidegger goes through Hölderlin's works, he dismissed it. Obviously the Bolsheviks are coming. It's not as if I'm going to accept that Hölderlin was in some way inspired by Kantian French revolutionary currents in interpreting Christian tradition of common ownership, commons, communities, and so on. So this is one of the examples that we can see, right? But also, I guess, with the question of interpreting French Revolution, I mean, you will probably find the same amount of conservatives, maybe traditionalists or monarchists or Christian monarchists that will completely disagree with this interpretation of French Revolution. So certainly we should, in this question, regard Heidegger's relation to Christianity also in a way to how he sees and perceives different currents of the Christian tradition, and perhaps the connection or the prioritization of pre-Christian, pre-Socratic traditions might also be a way of him going through certain currents of Christianity that were more aligned with this specific version of inequality, politics, whatever you want to perceive it as.
I mean, I think the general question is I guess that I assume Max is pushing on is that it depends on which question you're trying to answer. Is the question, what does Christianity think? Which then you yourself are doing work of theology or theological interpretation of the Christian tradition, in which case, of course, there's all kinds of other resources that one can draw from different texts. But then the question is, what did Heidegger think Christianity? Then we're contextualizing the interpretation of the dominant interpretation of Christianity in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Germany amongst conservatives, running from Nietzsche through Spengler to Heidegger, is clearly that Christianity has at best a kind of paradoxical relationship to questions of political and moral equality, in particular because Christianity plants the idea, which is absent in classical Greece, that humans, just by virtue of being humans, already have some worth and dignity, because we are made in the image of God, and that even the meekest and the mild and the weakest have value, and that even they are favored by Christ, and they will be rewarded in another life. This plants the seed of the idea of dignity, that each person, just in virtue of being a human, has dignity. In other words, that it's not something you need to achieve through actions. You don't have to do through great deeds. So it's the obliteration of an aristocratic culture in figures like Thucydides and whatnot, right? And that it's the leveling of an aristocratic and heroic culture in which worth is accomplished through overcoming our mortal, approximating gods by doing grand deeds which will stand the test of time, which will be spoken of forever, Heracles, et cetera, and the replacement of that by a Christian notion, which is that no matter what you do, the simplest and lowest and most humble of us already has worth, and that plants the idea of dignity. And then that comes to fruition later in things like the French Revolution. And so that's what those late 19th and early 20th century German conservatives thought. And I think too, that he's trying to, as you say, he's trying to wed that with another development, which is that, like you said, that kind of 1920s, like another contextualization is Heisenberg, Einstein, Gödel in mathematics, and the rise of the problem of uncertainty, and that ultimately we cannot know reality, and the attempt to turn that into a positive thing. It's like, okay, we cannot know reality, but we can know that we don't know, and that becomes an attempt to try to revalue the notion of uncertainty. And being in time is very much in that, I think, vein. The reason why it's, a work of the 20s is an attempt to respond to that. And I think it's then trying to wed those two things together by trying to say, that being is not a thing which can be known. It is a working out of the possibilities projected in understanding, and therefore is always ungraspable fully. But we can know that, and so one could write a book called Being in Time that attempts to articulate that principle, and that nevertheless through almost, I think, the reason why it also has a politically conservative tone is that it's through submission to being. It's a sort of submitting oneself to the grandness of, well, first it's language. That language is the house of being.
Right.
It is the grander thing. And then we don't speak language, but it speaks us and all this kind of idea. Then you reverse these. So we submit ourselves. So then it has this notion of a kind of that choice and free will actually is best expressed through submission and capitulation to something grander, which makes that choice and free will possible. That's the conservative response to that problem in that period, I think. And that's, to me, why they're deeply suspicious of at least certain strands of Christianity. It's because they see it as already coming with the notion of a kind of inherent dignity of persons, regardless of deeds. And so certainly that's like the Nietzschean strand. And Heidegger's lectures on Nietzsche really hammer home that point over and over again. Right. That's what's valuable.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, you can even add another layer that is Heidegger's hierarchies between languages. So you have a German that is the language that is so close to Greek that basically they are interchangeable.
Yeah.
And then you have all the other languages. But the other languages also have a hierarchy. So his opposition to Latin is interesting because Latin, for him, is a kind of a cold, rational, abstract language. So it's the language of these universal abstractions and categories. For that reason, Latin is the enemy. Whereas German is always warm and concrete and rooted in something traditional, like a Greek. So, but is a part of the same thing. Is this constant allergy that Heidegger didn't invent. He shares with all the entire Völkisch tradition. Is the allergy against everything is abstract, universal, and politically dangerous, because universal categories could easily lead to emancipation, dignity, human dignity, and so on. So you cannot, in any case, there are many political, but the interesting thing is, I think to find the political implication, not in Heidegger's membership to the National Socialist Party, is in this theory, in the category. And how Heidegger developed his philosophy. And then my second question is, what is the reason of this Heidegger's Renaissance at the end of the 20th century? That has to do with a new way of attack against universal categories. And then I suspend my judgment. Is it for a noble reason or not? But that is something that happened at the end of the 20th century. And I think Heidegger could re-enter in the conversation because of that.
It's also very symptomatic of a general zeitgeist sense of decline and decay. Right? So that's what I thought. I was curious about just the title of your talk, Christian eschatology, is that because another reason why it's a little out of step with at least the notion of a Christian notion that time is the unconcealing of being and the unconcealing of what always already was, the coming to fruition of a prophecy that was planted prior to Christ. The reason why the Heideggerian notion is different is because it's very much a story of decline. It's like a reverse eschatology, right? It's like the Greeks were closer, and then there's a period of the forgetting of being, and that we have actually ended in a period. And that's what's so, for all those conservatives, it's such a hard thing for them to square the idea that there is this great and aristocratic culture, but if it's so great, why did it lose? Why is it, if it's so wonderful and so obviously closer to being, why is it so small? Why do they feel so aggrieved and that they're being swamped? So that's why it feeds this story, like the Nietzschean story, like it's the triumph of the slaves, that its slave morality has. So you have to figure out how to square that idea that the meek have actually come to dominate over the great. Well, that seems oxymoronic. If they're great, then how come they're losing? And so they have to tell this bizarre story of how like the weak and passive of the earth have come to dominate over the great and heroic, which seems on the face of it counterintuitive, at least, right? Never mind the political implications. It just seems like logically incoherent to say that how can the great be so subordinated? And they state, well, Christianity is a big part of that, because Christianity Christianity saps the energy by inverting the values. It starts to valorize weakness. It starts to valorize, and it's the priestly class, like saps the life out of the aristocratic class, and they're trying to restore that. But to restore that, we have to reach the pre-Christian world, right? So his is a kind of like reverse eschatology.
Heidegger's.
Yeah. Or that's certainly that whole tradition kind of from, the 1870s through the 1920s, 1930s ends up with this.
Okay. And by reverse eschatology, you're talking about the actual going back into Greek antiquity and pulling from there. Because it's influenced by that, I'm clearly it's influenced by that.
But you don't even need to go back, because that I think that reverse eschatology, that origin, that origin is not historical. It's a present in your language. Obviously not Italian or Latin, but German and Greek. So Heidegger's playing with the etymologies is basically his way to disclose the truth of the language by disclosing the very origin of the language. So there is no need to go back to the pre-Socratic. It's a kind of if you want, one term that was not discussed in this presentation, but one can say it's a kairotic intervention. The kairos from Heidegger, the tension between the yet and not yet, is within the language. It is in the possibility that the language can open up in terms of you play with the past possibilities in the history of thought, in the history of philosophy, and then in a certain way, this origin, this origin is here, is right now here in front of me. Is the language that I can speak.
Different interpretation of the turn is that Heidegger loses faith even in language, which is why. So it goes from philosophy to poetry, to just art, to just like the ringing of a bell, like he becomes like it's like Zen Buddhism at the end, and then it's silence itself, which is the only thing that can bring us back. That's the meaning of the only a God can save us now. Is that being in time still thinks that there's some reason to write work of philosophy, right? And then it's let's write poetry, then it's visual art, then it's just silence itself, because it's almost like a collapse of even the idea that by recovering classical Greek terms or by dwelling on the nature of German terminology and the language can even hold people. Yes. So then we just sit in silence.
I mean, I thank you for the notion of silence, because I did not think of that at the sort of his coming to the very end in some ways is the silencing, or in some ways, or his acknowledgement for some silence. I hadn't sort of thought of it that way. That is not how I suppose I read the interview, nor the very statement of only a God can save us, because then, he would end up having to admit that his very sort of philosophical program ends up in the very nihilism that he's trying to, or meaninglessness that he's trying to, I suppose, get away from, right?
Well, the only way God can save us now, I take it to mean, is that we cannot save ourselves.
Exactly.
There's nothing that we can do.
Exactly.
There's no action we can take. There is nothing. It has to come externally.
Right.
Some external force.
Right.
Source.
Right.
Which is what people say. That still sounds fascistic, because it's like, even though it's just, you have to wait for some grand event to swoop in and change. Like, there's nothing we can do. We can't plan our way out of this, or, there's nothing. So it's a complete capitulation to irrationality, to Gnostic waiting for being to intervene.
Right.
And so
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.